What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors walks onto a daytime talk show and everything spirals out of control? Michael J. Fox, the man who captured hearts in Back to the Future and inspired millions with his Parkinson's advocacy, found himself in the middle of a confrontation that nobody saw coming. The tension was thick, the words were sharp, and by the end, cameras stopped rolling in a way that left the entire studio speechless. But before we get into what actually went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story is absolutely wild. The morning started like any other taping of The View. The studio audience filed in. Excited for another episode of Hot Topics and celebrity guests, Michael had been booked weeks in advance to discuss his latest memoir and his continued work with the Michael J. Fox Foundation. The producers were thrilled, the audience was buzzing, and everyone expected a feel-good segment that would tug at heartstrings and maybe even go viral for all the right reasons. What they got instead was something entirely different. Michael walked out to thunderous applause, that signature smile lighting up his face as he waved to the crowd. He took his seat at the table, greeting each host with warmth. Whoopi welcomed him, Sarah gave him a hug, and the others exchanged pleasantries. But there was something in the air, a subtle shift that some people in the audience later said they noticed right away. Joy Behar, sitting at her usual spot, had a look on her face that suggested this wasn't going to be just another friendly interview. The conversation began smoothly enough. Whoopi opened with questions about the book, letting Michael talk about his journey, his family, and the challenges he'd faced. He was eloquent, as always, mixing humor with honesty in that way that made people love him. The audience laughed when he cracked jokes and fell silent during the more serious moments. It was the kind of interview that reminded everyone why he remained such a cherished figure in entertainment. Then Joy jumped in. Her first question seemed innocent on the surface, asking about a particular chapter in the book where Michael discussed political activism. But the way she phrased it, the tone she used, it carried an edge that made Michael pause. He answered carefully, explaining his views without being preachy, trying to keep things light. Joy pressed harder, bringing up specific political figures and asking Michael to take a stronger stance than he seemed comfortable with. The other hosts exchanged glances, sensing the shift in energy. Michael tried to redirect, emphasizing that his foundation worked with people across the political spectrum. Because Parkinson's didn't care about party affiliation, it was a diplomatic answer, the kind that should have smoothed things over. But Joy wasn't letting it go. She leaned forward, her voice taking on that prosecutorial tone she was known for, and questioned whether staying neutral was really the right approach in what she called critical times. Michael's smile faltered slightly, though he maintained his composure. The audience grew quiet, the easy laughter from earlier replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Sarah tried to interject with a lighter question, but Joy spoke over her, directing another pointed question at Michael. This time she brought up a statement he'd made years ago, taking it somewhat out of context and asking him to defend it. Michael's jaw tightened. He took a breath, and when he responded, there was steel in his voice that hadn't been there before. He told Joy that he understood she had strong opinions, but that misrepresenting his words wasn't fair or productive. The audience let out a collective gasp. It wasn't aggressive, but it was direct, and Michael J. Fox being direct in that way was rare enough that everyone took notice. Joy's eyes widened, and for a moment it seemed like she might back down. Instead, she doubled down, suggesting that Michael's privilege allowed him to stay above the fray, while others suffered the consequences of political inaction. Michael leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, and said something that made even Whoopi's eyes go wide. He told Joy that living with Parkinson's for over 3 decades had taught him plenty about suffering and consequence, and that questioning his commitment to making a difference was not only insulting, but fundamentally ignorant of the work. He dedicated his life to. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. Joy's face flushed red. She started to respond, her voice rising, but Michael wasn't finished. He continued, his voice shaking slightly, but not from his condition, from genuine anger. He talked about the countless hours spent advocating, fundraising, pushing for research funding, working with scientists and politicians from every background. He spoke about the people he'd met who were suffering, the families torn apart by this disease, and how dare anyone suggest he was sitting comfortably on the sidelines. The other hosts were frozen. Whoopi tried to cut to commercial, but the producers apparently weren't ready. Leaving everyone in this excruciating moment of live television, Joy, instead of backing down or apologizing, shot back that she wasn't attacking his foundation work, but his refusal to use his platform more aggressively on broader political issues. Michael's laugh was bitter. He said that his platform had always been about the work, not about scoring political points on television. And maybe that was a concept foreign to some people at this table. The audience gasped again, louder this time. A few people could be heard whispering. Sarah put her hand on Michael's arm, trying to de-escalate, but he gently pulled away. Joy stood up from her seat, something that almost never happened during an interview segment. She pointed at Michael and said that if he couldn't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't come on shows like this. Michael stood up too, his body trembling now, a mix of emotion and his condition, and replied that there was a difference between tough questions and being ambushed with bad faith arguments. Whoopi finally managed to signal for a commercial break, her voice firm as she told the control room to cut, but the cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Joy and Michael locked in a stare that was part anger, part disbelief. When they finally did cut, chaos erupted in the studio. Producers rushed the stage, audience members were talking over each other, and Michael was immediately surrounded by staff who were trying to figure out what to do next. Behind the scenes, the argument continued. According to people who were there, Joy refused to apologize, insisting she'd done nothing wrong and that Michael had overreacted. Michael, meanwhile, was telling producers that he felt disrespected and blindsided, that the line of questioning had been designed to provoke rather than inform. The other hosts were split, some trying to mediate, others clearly taking sides based on their own relationships with Joy. The decision was made quickly. Too quickly for some people's liking. A producer came to Michael and told him that it would be best if he left, that they'd figure out how to handle the rest of the show without him. Michael was stunned. He asked if Joy was being asked to leave too, and when the answer was no, his face hardened. He said something under his breath, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the exit. Sarah followed him, trying to apologize, trying to explain that this wasn't how things were supposed to go. But Michael was done. At the stage door, he turned to the small group that had followed him and said clearly that he'd come in good faith to talk about his work and his life, and instead had been treated like a political prop. He said he expected better from a show that claimed to celebrate diverse viewpoints and meaningful conversation. Then he walked out, leaving the studio in absolute turmoil. The studio was in complete disarray. Production assistants scrambled to figure out how to fill the remaining airtime, while the hosts huddled together trying to process what had just happened. Joy stood off to the side, arms crossed, still visibly angry and refusing to acknowledge that anything she'd done was inappropriate. Whoopi was on her phone, presumably talking to network executives who were now dealing with a publicity nightmare in real time. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them recording on their phones, despite the strict no recording policy, already imagining how this would blow up on social media when they came back from commercial. Whoopi addressed the audience with a carefully worded statement. She said that sometimes conversations get heated, that passionate people have passionate disagreements, and that they would continue the show as planned. But her voice lacked its usual confidence, and anyone watching could tell something major had happened. Joy sat, stone-faced, barely participating in the rest of the episode, while the other hosts tried desperately to bring back the energy and move on to lighter topics. It didn't work. The entire rest of the show felt hollow, like everyone was going through the motions while thinking about the explosion that had just occurred. Meanwhile, Michael was in his car, being driven away from the studio. His publicist was already on the phone with him, asking what happened, trying to get ahead of the story. Michael recounted the conversation, his voice still shaking with frustration. He kept coming back to one point, that he'd been willing to discuss anything, to engage with any topic, but that what Joy had done wasn't discussion, it was an attack disguised as journalism. His publicist listened, taking notes, already drafting statements in her head about how to handle the inevitable media firestorm back at the studio. During the next commercial break, things got even more complicated. According to multiple sources who were present, Whoopi pulled Joy aside and told her that she'd crossed a line. Joy fired back that she was doing her job, asking the questions that needed to be asked, and that Michael's reaction proved he couldn't handle real scrutiny. Whoopi shook her head, pointing out that there was a difference between scrutiny and being deliberately confrontational with a guest who came on to talk about his health advocacy. The conversation grew heated, with other staff members watching nervously from a distance. Sarah, who had developed a friendship with Michael over the years through various charity events, was visibly upset. During another break, she was overheard saying that this was exactly the kind of thing that made good people stop wanting to come on the show, that treating guests like adversaries rather than conversation partners was damaging to everyone involved. Sunny chimed in, suggesting that maybe the political climate had made everyone too quick to turn every discussion into a battle. Alyssa stayed mostly quiet, but her expression suggested she agreed that things had gone too far. The show eventually ended, and the moment the cameras stopped rolling, the real arguments began. Joy defended herself vigorously, insisting that Michael's celebrity status didn't shield him from legitimate questions about his political positions or lack thereof. She argued that his influence meant he had a responsibility to take stronger stances, and that pressing him on that wasn't unfair, it was necessary. Whoopi countered that context mattered, that ambushing a guest who came to discuss his foundation and his memoir with aggressive political interrogation wasn't journalism. It was a setup. The argument spread through the entire production team. Some staff members sided with Joy, believing that no topic should be off-limits and that Michael had indeed been too defensive. Others were appalled, pointing out that the interview had veered so far from the agreed-upon topics that it constituted a breach of trust with the guest. One producer reportedly said that if they started treating every guest like a hostile witness, they'd run out of people willing to appear on the show. Another shot back that maybe they should only book people willing to engage in real conversation, not just promotional softball sessions. Within hours, clips of the confrontation started appearing online. Someone in the audience had indeed recorded parts of the exchange, and despite the shaky footage and poor audio quality, the intensity of the moment came through clearly. Social media exploded. Michael's fans were outraged, flooding the View's accounts with criticism and demanding an apology. Joy's supporters defended her, arguing that she'd simply asked tough questions and that Michael's reaction was evidence of his own discomfort with being challenged. The divide was sharp and immediate, with thousands of people weighing in from every possible angle. News outlets picked up the story within the hour. Entertainment reporters scrambled to get statements from representatives of both The View and Michael. The network released a bland statement saying they valued robust discussion and respected all their guests. Michael's team put out something more pointed, saying he'd been disappointed by the direction of the interview and felt the conversation had become unnecessarily combative. Neither statement satisfied anyone, and both sides demanded more clarity, more accountability, more explanation of what had actually happened and why. Behind the scenes at The View, emergency meetings were being called. Network executives needed to figure out how to handle this without losing face or credibility. The show had weathered controversies before, but this felt different. Michael J. Fox wasn't some politician or polarizing figure. He was universally beloved, known more for his grace and humor than for controversy. The optics of him walking off the show, or more accurately being asked to leave, were terrible. Some executives reportedly wanted Joy to issue an apology, while others worried that doing so would suggest the show had done something wrong and open them up to more criticism. Joy, meanwhile, was doubling down. In conversations with colleagues after the taping, she maintained that she'd done nothing wrong and that the backlash was overblown. She suggested that people were being too sensitive, too protective of celebrity feelings, and that real journalism required making people uncomfortable sometimes. Some of her colleagues nodded along, but others looked increasingly uncomfortable with her justifications. The divide within the show's team was growing wider by the hour, threatening to become a full-blown internal crisis. The other hosts were caught in the middle. None of them wanted to publicly criticize Joy, who was not only a colleague, but in many ways the show's most recognizable voice besides Whoopi, but privately, several of them expressed frustration with how the situation had been handled. Sarah, in particular, was reportedly very upset, feeling that a friendship had been damaged and that the show's reputation had taken an unnecessary hit. She'd been texting with Michael, trying to apologize on behalf of the production, though she made clear she was speaking for herself, not for the show. As the day wore on, more details leaked out. Multiple sources confirmed that Michael had indeed been asked to leave, rather than choosing to walk out on his own. This detail shifted the narrative significantly. What had initially been framed by some as Michael storming off in a huff was now being understood as the show, removing a guest who'd been subjected to an ambush interview. The public reaction intensified. Hashtags started trending, with Michael's supporters demanding accountability and Joy's defenders insisting the outrage was manufactured. Celebrity friends of Michael began speaking out. Several actors who'd worked with him over the years posted supportive messages, praising his character and questioning what had happened. Some specifically called out The View, suggesting that the show owed him an apology. A few went further, saying they'd declined future invitations to appear on the program until the situation was addressed properly. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions, and the network's carefully neutral stance was becoming increasingly untenable. Inside the View offices, the mood was tense. Staff members were taking sides, with some openly criticizing how the situation had been handled, and others defending the show's right to ask difficult questions. One segment producer reportedly resigned in protest, sending an email that detailed their concerns about the direction the show was taking and their belief that guest relations had become secondary to generating viral moments. Whether this resignation was directly related to the Michael incident or had been brewing for other reasons wasn't entirely clear, but the timing added fuel to the fire. Joy herself remained defiant in meetings with producers and network representatives. She argued that backing down or apologizing would set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that hosts couldn't challenge guests on important issues. She framed the controversy as an attack on journalistic integrity, positioning herself as someone willing to ask hard questions despite public backlash. Some people in these meetings found her arguments compelling, while others felt she was missing the point entirely. That this wasn't about tough questions, but about respect and context and keeping your word about what an interview would cover. The next morning brought no relief for anyone involved. Major news networks were now covering the story, showing the clips that had spread across social media and bringing on commentators to discuss what it all meant. Some framed it as a cautionary tale about how divided the country had become, where even a conversation with Michael J. Fox couldn't stay civil. Others focused on the specific dynamics between Joy and Michael, analyzing their words and body language frame by frame. A few talked about the broader issue of how talk shows treated guests, questioning whether the pursuit of viral moments had overtaken basic courtesy and good faith discussion. The View's social media accounts were being bombarded with comments, an overwhelming majority of them critical. People weren't just upset about how Michael had been treated, they were questioning the show's entire approach to interviews. Old clips started resurfacing of other contentious moments, other interviews that had gone sideways, creating a narrative that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. Former guests began speaking out, some anonymously, about their own experiences feeling ambushed or misled about what topics would be covered. The dam was breaking, and what had started as one bad interview was becoming a referendum on the show itself. Whoopi called an emergency meeting with all the hosts before that day's taping. According to people familiar with the conversation, she made it clear that they needed to address what had happened, that ignoring it would only make things worse. Joy pushed back, arguing that addressing it would validate the outrage and make them look weak. The other hosts had mixed opinions, with some agreeing they needed to say something and others worried about making the situation bigger by continuing to talk about it. The meeting reportedly grew tense, with raised voices and frustrations that had been simmering for months finally bubbling to the surface. When they went live, Whoopi opened the show by acknowledging the controversy. She said that yesterday had featured a conversation that became more heated than anyone intended, and that they valued Michael J. Fox and the important work he did. It was carefully worded, acknowledging something had happened without admitting fault or apologizing. Joy sat beside her, expression neutral, saying nothing. The camera occasionally cut to her, and viewers could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. She was clearly unhappy about even this mild acknowledgement. The show tried to move on to other topics, but the energy was off. Phone calls from viewers were overwhelmingly about the Michael incident, with people demanding a real apology and calling out what they saw as a non-statement. Social media lit up again, with people pointing out that Whoopi's comments hadn't actually apologized for anything or taken responsibility for asking Michael to leave. The hashtags started trending even harder, with more celebrities chiming in, and more people sharing their own stories about feeling disrespected or ambushed in media appearances. By midday, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Network executives made the decision that something more had to be done. They called Joy into a meeting, along with the show's executive producers. What was said in that meeting remained somewhat unclear, but multiple sources suggest that Joy was given an ultimatum. She could issue a personal apology to Michael, acknowledging that the interview had gotten out of hand, or she could face more serious consequences. Joy reportedly refused outright, stating that she wouldn't apologize for doing her job and that forcing her to would compromise her integrity and credibility. The standoff lasted for hours. Executives tried different approaches, suggesting various ways Joy could address the situation without fully capitulating, but she remained unmoved. She felt she was being scapegoated for a situation that involved multiple people and decisions, that Michael had been just as confrontational in his responses, and that the public reaction was disproportionate to what had actually occurred. Her colleagues were divided, some supporting her stance on principle, while others wished she would just apologize so they could all move forward. Meanwhile, Michael was dealing with his own flood of attention. Interview requests poured in from every major outlet, all wanting him to tell his side of the story. To go into detail about what had happened and how he felt about it, his publicist advised him to stay quiet, to let the situation die down naturally rather than feeding it with more comments. But Michael was wrestling with his own feelings about the whole thing. Part of him wanted to just move on, to get back to his work and forget the entire incident. Another part felt that staying silent might suggest he'd been in the wrong, or that he was backing down from what he'd said. His phone was full of supportive messages from friends, colleagues, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years. They all expressed shock at how he'd been treated and praised him for standing up for himself. Several suggested he use this moment to speak more broadly about how people with disabilities were sometimes treated in media spaces, how his Parkinson's might have been a factor in Joy's willingness to be so aggressive, whether consciously or not. Michael wasn't sure about that angle, didn't want to make assumptions about her motivations, but the suggestion stayed with him. Back at the View, the situation was deteriorating further. Staff members were leaking more details to the press, describing the internal chaos and the deep divisions among the team. One leak suggested that this wasn't just about the Michael interview, that there had been growing tensions for months about the show's direction and tone. Another claimed that some hosts had been wanting to address concerns about Joy's interview style for a while, but had been shut down by producers, who valued her provocative approach because it generated attention and ratings. That evening, another development shifted everything. A prominent Parkinson's advocacy group released a statement expressing disappointment in how The View had handled the interview. They didn't attack Joy directly, but they made clear that Michael had been invited to discuss his foundation work and his memoir, and that turning the conversation into a political interrogation had been inappropriate given the context. They pointed out that people living with serious illnesses already faced enough challenges without being subjected to needless conflict when trying. To advocate for research and support, the statement was measured but firm, and it carried significant weight. Other advocacy organizations followed suit, releasing their own statements of support for Michael and concern about how the interview had unfolded. Patient groups, medical research foundations, and disability rights organizations all weighed in creating a chorus of voices that couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored. This wasn't just angry fans on social media anymore. These were respected organizations with real influence, making clear that they saw a problem with what had happened. The network executives could no longer frame this as just overblown internet outrage. Joy watched all of this unfold with growing frustration. She felt the narrative had gotten away from the actual facts, that people were making her into a villain for simply asking questions. In conversations with friends and supporters, she expressed feeling betrayed by her own network for not backing her more forcefully, for allowing the situation to spiral instead of defending her journalistic approach. She believed that the real issue was people's unwillingness to have difficult conversations, their preference for comfortable publicity interviews over real dialogue. and that she was being punished for refusing to play that game. The other hosts were exhausted. They'd spent days fielding questions, dealing with the fallout, trying to keep the show functioning while this crisis played out. Sarah had continuing conversations with Michael, who told her he appreciated her reaching out, but that the damage had been done. He wasn't angry at her or the other hosts, he made that clear, but he felt the show as a whole had broken trust with him, and he wasn't sure that could be repaired. Sarah shared these conversations with Whoopi and the others, hoping it might help them understand the depth of the problem. A week after the incident, the network finally made a more definitive statement. They announced that they had reached out to Michael J. Fox directly to apologize for how the interview had been conducted, acknowledging that it had deviated significantly from the agreed-upon topics and tone. They didn't mention Joy by name, but they made clear that steps were being taken to ensure better communication with guests and clearer guidelines for interviews. It wasn't everything people were demanding, but it was more than the network had been willing to say before. Joy's reaction to this statement was reportedly furious. She saw it as the network throwing her under the bus to appease an angry mob, sacrificing her credibility to protect the show's reputation. She had heated conversations with producers about what this meant for her future on the program, whether she was expected to change her approach, whether she was being muzzled. The answers she got were unsatisfying, full of corporate speak about collaboration and respecting guests while also maintaining journalistic integrity. She left those meetings feeling more isolated than ever. So what do you think? Was Joy out of line, or was Michael too sensitive? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, because Hollywood never runs out of drama worth talking about.